the roots of the French Revolution, which are a little bit like the American Revolution, that has to do with taxation, but it's much broader. We're going to talk about the first phase of resistance, the first group of people that said to the king, we are not going to follow you blindly. If you want money from us, if you want taxes from us, we want representation. People that had no representation. Then you have the first phase of the revolution, which was relatively moderate compared to what came afterwards. The first phase of the revolution attempted to give France a constitutional monarchy like Britain had. Not to eliminate monarchy, just to make monarchy more limited, balanced. It's in this phase that the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which you read for me today, was produced. In the second phase of the revolution, it's when things get completely out of control and the French feel under threat that their revolutionary ideas are going to be destroyed, both internally and by enemies outside of France, and they decide the only way to survive is to completely eliminate their enemies at home. And by eliminate, I don't mean prison, I mean execution of their enemies at home, and going to war with their neighbors to crush those governments of monarchies and to spread ideas of democracy, representative government overseas, or, abroad. That was the idea. In practice, it was a little bit more dicey. So, this is Europe in 1789. 1789, the first year of the French Revolution. Here's France. I'll refer back to this map in time so you have an idea when I talk about wars, how bad it got. Here's France. Here's England across the English Channel, very narrow space. Spain down here on the border. On the southern border, this is what's known as the Italian states. There is no unified Italy yet. These are the Italian states. Switzerland. Over here, you have the German states. What else we got? Here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is our main enemy. Here's Russia over here, Prussia, and eventually I'll talk about the Turkish Empire. All I need you to take from this map right now is see that France is bordered in multiple places by monarchies. Monarchies that are scared of the revolutionary democratic ideas coming out of France. And they're afraid if they don't crush France now, those ideas will spread to their country, just like the ideas in America spread to France. Okay? A. Secondly, at a certain point in the first 10 years of the French Revolution, and especially afterwards under Napoleon, who I'll talk about next class, France was at war with everybody. Everybody was afraid of the ideas coming out of France. So France was at war with the British, the Spanish, some of the Italian states, the Prussians, a German-speaking people, the Austrians, and the Russians, and the Turks. And they won all those wars. In a similar example to, well, I don't need to make that example, but think of this. One country versus all these other people, one country of about, I think it's about 60 or 70 millions of people versus hundreds of millions, and they kept winning for reasons I'll get to a little bit today, a little bit next class. So, what is the roots of the French Revolution, which eventually destroyed absolute monarchy in France? Well, you can't go too further than economics. France had lent a lot of money and fought valiantly with the Americans during the American War of Independence. They were bankrupt, or close to bankrupt, because of helping the Americans in that war. Now the king had to raise more money, the absolute monarch of France, King Louis XVIII, who was like the great-grandson, I think it was a great-grandson of King Louis XIV, that great absolute monarch that we began this class discussing. King Louis XVIII wanted to be King Louis XVI King Louis XVI wanted to be like his grandfather, an absolute monarch, but he didn't have the charisma, the personality, the authority. He simply wasn't frightening enough. He had to raise more money to pay down the debt. The group that had the wealth that he could tax, the nobility. Now, when I say nobility, does everyone, who doesn't know what I'm talking about? It's okay, put your hand up. Everyone know what a noble is? Okay, great. France at this time, I will. France at this time was a society of orders. Orders meaning status, right? Depending on the status you were born into or were raised into, you had certain privileges. There were those that belonged to the clergy, and they had certain privileges, legal, etc. There were those that belonged to the nobility, and then everybody else. And I'll get into this in a moment. The nobles were the ones that had titles, prince, duke, etc. These titles were usually awarded by a previous king in reward of help in wartime or help in running the government. And it wasn't just the titles. You gave these people land. You gave them the ability to build castles, to protect their property, because they're your allies. Okay? Now, why do you do this? Why do you reward your friends? Because as a king, you want to keep your friends for future wars and future emergencies. But what's the problem? The problem is that once you give to a family a noble title, and you give them lands and the right to build castles, the right to have private armies, you can't take that back, because this is a privilege passed on from father to son. And if a noble family has been around for 300-400 years, very likely they're going to have more property, a larger private army, and greater wealth than possibly the king of France. So it's a good friend, but a potential enemy, right? Louis XIV dealt with these people by being rather harsh and clever. Louis XVI, the king of this period, was nowhere near as clever, harsh, etc. So he looked to the nobles and he said, you all have the money. And he looked to the church and says, you own all this land. I need to tax you to pay down the national debt. But the nobles and the churches, because of their particular privileges, had never been taxed at the level that the king wanted to tax them because of their privileges. And they said, no, we're not going to pay it. A, we've never done it before, and B, we just don't trust you because you have spent all this other money and driven France into bankruptcy. Well, if we were to give you this money, if we were to pay the taxes you're asking, what's the guarantee that you're not going to just simply spend it all away? So what we want from you is this. We want you to call the Estates General, which is the closest thing that France had to Parliament. It represented the various different parts of France who would come together in Paris and represent the people of France. But this was a rather unfair organization. It wasn't like our Congress, where there is equal representation, everybody gets one vote, and so on and so forth. Here, it was three groups that came together, nobles, churches, and everybody else, and they all had an equal vote. Now, if you put representatives of the nobles, representatives of the churches, and representatives of everybody else in the same room, and they could only vote as a group, all the nobles cast one vote, the church reps one vote, and everyone else, which two groups do you think are always going to have more in common than the third one? Nobles, church, and everyone else. Nobles and church, because they're the ones with all the wealth, the property, the authority, the privilege. The everybody else, or the third estate, they got nothing. They're the ones who want the changes, whereas the nobles and the church are the ones that want to keep things the same, or at least benefit them. So when they say to the king, we want you to call the Estates General, and only then, as representatives of the French people, will we agree to new taxes, they know if the Estates General is called, the nobles and the church will have the advantage, because it's a rigged election system, right? So that's That's one problem, economic debt. And the king doesn't want to give in to this, because the moment he calls the Estates General, he's no longer an absolute king. Now he's going to negotiate with a representative body, no matter how unfairly organized it is. Bureaucracy. The taxes that the king could legally collect were poorly collected, and much of it was siphoned and put into the pockets of the collectors illegally. And so the money that actually was supposed to get to Paris to pay down the debt, a lot of it got lost in transition. And so more taxes were raised on the people, who were already suffering economically because of a poor harvest in 1788. At this time, if the king can't tax the nobles and the clergy, he has to continue taxing the middle classes and the poor more and more to pay down his debt. But these particular people, especially the very poor, are now suffering even more because of a poor harvest in 1788. Less food was grown because of bad weather, which means the food that was actually grown was higher in price because there was less of it, making it harder for poor people to just simply survive. And at this time, the king is continuously demanding more and more taxes because these people, the middle and poorer classes, are the only ones he could legally tax. The nobles in the church are not giving in, and he doesn't want to force them to give in because they're basically his allies. In addition to the higher taxation, you have ideas. You've got the suffering of the poor and the middle classes economically. You have now ideas of the Enlightenment that are percolating, which was John Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu. All these guys have taught the French, the elites, and even the common people that absolute government is corrupt government. Something's got to be done about it. You need representative, you need a constitution, you need a Bill of Rights. Otherwise, absolutism will always be the result. Feudalism is also a bad idea. Feudalism is the notion that as a noble, you own your own land, and the people that you employ on that land, you have complete and total domination over them as if they are your slaves. And you pass on that neo-slavery title from parents to child, parent to child. This was slowly dying out, but it was still there. And so anti-feudalism means a belief in the equality of all people to freedom, the end of slavery, or slavery by another name. And basically all of these ideas that had filtered down through the Enlightenment. Equality, natural rights, representative government, and so on and so on and so on. Because by this time, the French have not only become familiar with the writings of John Locke, Baron Montesquieu, who wrote about representative government, Voltaire, who wrote about the evils of absolute government, Rousseau, who else? Oh, and by this point, they would have read the Declaration of Independence. They would have witnessed the American Revolutionary War, and so they want to change. And so the government is demanding more and more money, and now they have these ideas to respond. And then this group comes along, the middle classes, or the bourgeoisie. This is the motor of the first phase of the revolution. This wasn't the poor. These are the people that had education, they had wealth, but they lacked the one thing that they were told by the philosophers they deserved. They already had property, the vote. They had no political power because there was no voting. And because of the kind of screwy organizational system of French society, nobles, clergy, and then everybody else. Nobles and clergy had all the privileges. The everybody else, or the third estate, which is what that group was a part of, they had none. So they were the most susceptible to the idea of they deserved a say in French government, especially since they're paying all those taxes. Right? So the king gives in. In 1788, the fall, summer, fall of 1788, he's got to do something. He's got no money. The nobles and the clergy are the only ones he can reasonably start taxing because he can't squeeze any more money out of the poor. And they're not going to give any money unless he calls this Estates General, which automatically limits his power as an absolute king. Now, as I mentioned, this is an unfair organizational structure. The representatives of France do not meet in one room and all have an equal vote. They meet as representatives of their order or estate. Representatives of the clergy, the nobility, or the third estate. The first estate represented the clergy, and there was only 100,000 members of the clergy in France, rich and poor. They were organized by the fact that they were members of the church. The second estate of the nobility, there was about nearly 500,000 of them. They had the same number of representation as the first estate. Even though they had more nobles than clergy, in France, they were allowed to send the same number of representatives to Paris to sit in the Estates General. The third estate was everybody else that wasn't a member of the clergy and did not have a noble title. This was 24 million Frenchmen and women. They were told to send the exact same number of representatives to Paris as these two groups. So if these folks could send 20 representatives to Paris, and these folks sent 20, and these folks sent 20, and they were all told, you will vote as a group. You cast one, you cast one, you cast one. It's inherently unfair. These two will always outvote this group 2-1, even though they only represent 500,000 French people, and this group represents 24 million French people. You follow? This is the grand unequal organization of society based on the idea that equality is not the point here. It's your status in society. And it's not even wealth, because there's rich and poor clergy, rich and poor nobility, and rich and poor members of the third estate. It's your status in society. But this crumbles in the face of John Locke's idea that everybody is born free and equal, and government is meant to represent the people. So, I already mentioned that. So, what happens? The third estate, the Estates General, they meet in Paris. The representatives of the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, they meet in Paris, and they met separately. And what happens? From the very beginning, the middle classes, who are the leaders of the third estate, these are the bourgeoisie, because poor people couldn't send representatives to Paris because poor people were working. So they sent lawyers and doctors who had the money to go to Paris and sit around and discuss constitutions and laws. So the bourgeoisie, the leaders of the third estate, they go to Paris, and as soon as they get there, instead of accepting this unequal organization, they say, we're not going to participate. If you want us to accept any new laws, any new taxes, we are not going to participate in this unfair system of government, the Estates General. We're not going to do it. And by this point, the king is desperate because the country is going further and further into bankruptcy, and he needs somebody to vote new taxes. And the third estate represents 24 million French people. If they say, we're not playing, and they stop paying their taxes, then he's in even worse trouble. So what are they asking for? They're asking for some revolutionary stuff. They say, first of all, right now, all three groups have equal representatives. Let's just say everybody sent 20 representatives each. 20, 20, 20. You follow me so far? It's not 20, but that's the number that's convenient. The third estate says, we represent 24 million Frenchmen. At the very least, we should have twice as many representatives in Paris than those other two groups. And we want all these individuals to meet in the same room and each human being to have an individual vote. Now, the king refused this. Why? Because if you have all these people meeting in the same room and every individual allowed to cast an individual vote, not having to vote as a group, Well, the chances are you might find some nobles that are sympathetic to the ideas of the bourgeoisie. You might find some clergy that are sympathetic to the ideas of the bourgeoisie, and they would vote against the members of their order with the bourgeoisie. So what the third estate is suggesting would completely change the rules of the game from automatically losing every vote to pretty much automatically winning every vote. And the king says, no, we're not doing it. Because if we do that, then I lose all my authority as an absolute monarch. But he gets desperate. And the bourgeoisie, the third estate, they say, well, you know what? And this is truly the most revolutionary step that France has seen so far. They decide on June 17th, 1789, it doesn't matter what the king says, it doesn't matter what the nobility says, it doesn't matter what the king says. We represent 24 million Frenchmen. We represent over 90% of the people of France. We don't need your permission to start acting as the representatives of France. We will declare ourselves the National Assembly. Think about that name. The third estate is the third most important grouping of the Estates General. But the National Assembly is, we represent everybody. And they said to the nobles and to the clergy, you're welcome to join us, but we're no longer playing with you. We are now acting on behalf of the French people because we represent 90% of them. You don't. We believe in equality and democracy. You don't. And we're tired of waiting for you to catch up. On June 20th, the National Assembly, they met in their usual meeting place to start having serious discussions about the future of France, and they find that meeting place locked. They automatically assume the king locked the door to crush their political movement. So they moved to the only big open space available to them to have a meeting, which happened to be a tennis court. And there they got together and they swore an oath. Nobody goes home to their town and their city until France has a constitution. Enough of this absolute monarchy business. No one's going home. We were sent here temporarily, but we're not going home until we have a constitution. Now the king's got a problem, because these folks are not leaving. And no one's collecting new taxes, and the bankruptcy keeps going. On June 27th, a week later, the king orders the nobles and the clergy to abandon their original meeting place, to join the National Assembly under the rules established by the bourgeoisie, where everybody sits in the same room, everybody casts an independent vote for every new law that takes place. This is revolutionary. Absolute monarchy from this point forward is basically over, because the king has given in to the people's desire to have representative government. And what are they going to do when they get together and talk? They're going to talk about a constitution. They're going to talk about a Bill of Rights. They're going to talk about transforming France into something like the United States. And then what happened? The people got involved. What people? Aren't the bourgeoisie the people? Yes, but they are the middle classes, the people that have wealth. What about the poor? The ones that are that are being taxed. The ones that are suffering from high food costs. What's going on with them? At this point in the summer of 1789, they get sucked into the revolution. Because imagine this. For years, you've been paying taxes that get worse and worse. You've never been told that you have a right to any say in your government. You have gotten used to oppression from anybody. And now all of a sudden, there's this thing happening in Paris where the people have gotten together and they have forced the king to recognize the rights of the people. Your hopes are going to go up that maybe further changes are happening. Maybe you'll get the vote. Maybe taxes will be lowered. Maybe food will become more affordable. But then you start hearing rumors. You start hearing rumors that the king is bringing troops into Paris to crush the revolution. And so now you have your raised expectations and the fear that they're going to be gone in just a couple of days. So you have rising hopes, the threat that it's going to end, and you still have these damn taxes and the high cost of food. At this point, the people of Paris, the capital city, but also the people in the countryside, realize they got nothing left to lose. They're already suffering, and there's a hope of improvement if they just get involved. And up until this point, they haven't been involved. This is the guy that they are rebelling against, King Louis XVI. And the reason I like this picture, because do you remember King Louis XIV? The first picture from the first class, with the hair and the scepter and the robe, right? This is the exact opposite. He was universally known as a rather weak individual, unlike his grandfather, King Louis XIV. On July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris rose up in a bloody rebellion. They attacked the troops of King Louis XIV, who they suspected were there to crush the revolution, and they stormed or seized the Bastille, which was a prison universally known as the place where kings would throw their enemies into without any court, any justice, and would keep them there forever. You would disappear into the Bastille if the king decided he didn't like you, without any court case. So this was the symbol of royal despotism and tyranny. So the people of Paris, men and women, rose up, killed French soldiers, cut off their heads, put them on spikes, paraded through the streets, eventually stormed the Bastille, went in there, murdered more soldiers and a bunch of prisoners as well. The French king ordered his troops to open fire onto the rebelling Parisian people. But the thing is, many of these French troops, they had friends and family that came from the Parisian people, and they sympathized with this idea that we needed a change in France, and they refused to fire. Some of them joined the rebellion. And any king or leader will tell you, the moment that your army or your police stops following your orders, it's time for you to pack up and go home. Because you go from being the head of a government to just a guy giving orders that no one's paying attention to. So, that was in the city of Paris. In the countryside, what happens in the summer of 1789 is called the Great Fear. Rumors that troops are crushing the rebellion in Paris, but also that troops are spreading through the countryside to stop reform there, also motivates the poor people of the countryside to rise up against any source of authority. This is basically what it looked like, people on the rampage in the countryside. But look at this map. This is, somebody managed to track the spread of this popular uprising. These red dots essentially represent where the rumors of repression started, and then it just spread from town to town, village to village, city to city, where it engulfed all of France. The revolution wasn't just taking place in Paris. All across France, people were fearing that this hope for a better world was coming to an end, and they simply attacked any sign of authority. Churches, bishops, nobles, noble homes, castles, whatever they can get their hands on. And they burned the records in these homes that said how much obligations or money they owed to the nobles or the churches or whatever the case may be. The result was the National Assembly realized that they had to move fast. They had to move fast because if they didn't, the people of Paris and the people of the French countryside were likely going to become even more frustrated and turn on them. So they passed a couple of laws immediately to tell the people, your thoughts, your wishes are being listened to, the government is responding. On August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly abolishes all privilege. What does that mean? On August 4th, 1789, everybody in France was now a citizen, equal in rights to everybody else. There was no more church, nobles, and third estate. There was just French citizens. Everybody was equal in the face of the law. Everybody had the same rights. Everybody had the same obligations. No more privilege. But then they took a much grander step forward. And on August 27th, they laid out the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which said specifically in France the rights of the individual that all governments must respect. And with that segue, let's pull out that document. And let's look at the French Declaration and the U.S. Bill of Rights. There are some commonalities. There are some differences that I'd like to talk about. That coffee is now cold and disappointing. All right. So, Kenneth in the back, John in the back, James up front, Jennifer in the back, Richard. All right. So, the prompt asked you to write a paragraph highlighting the major points these documents have in common. So, and whatever important differences you find. So who wants to start me off of the names that I called? Kenneth? Start me off. Okay. Give me whatever you got. Give me some highlights, or you know what? Let's start with the similarities, and then we'll get to the differences in a little bit. Okay?
All right. There was one similarity in the first Bill of Rights, which is freedom of speech, press, religion, and petition, and the French Declaration of the Rights of Men in Articles 10 to 11, stating that no one shall be disquieted on account of his opinion. In addition, every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom.
Okay, very good. Why do you think both declarations, or let's just call them, both of them, a list of rights, all right? Let's just call them that, the French and the American list of rights, just for the sake of convenience. Why do you think both of them made it one of their priorities to state that individuals have the freedom to speak their opinion, free of any punishment? Yep?
Well, that's what they were lacking to begin with.
Right. But think about, okay, very good. The fact that it was missing in the first place, they had to make it up to a law to correct the problem, right? What was the goal of making this a law? What was the goal? Zarisha, you had a hand up.
I was just going to say that freedom of expression facilitates democratic representative government.
It does, because everyone says their opinion, and the government has to respond to the people. If the people can express their opinion freely, then government knows what it should be doing, right? If governments are not listening to the people because they are silencing the people, what is the result?
Another revolution.
Another revolution. But what do governments do when they're not directly responsible to the will of the people? What do they end up doing? Tyrannical. When there's no pushback, that's what happened in France, that's what happened in Britain, that's what happened in the American Revolution, and thus you have a rebellion. Remember the English Bill of Rights. One of the things in the English Bill of Rights was the freedom of speech in Parliament, so that the members of Parliament could tell the king when he was being unfair, and he couldn't arrest them. What other similarity? Now, and remember, these lists of rights are meant to guarantee the rights of the people against a tyrannical government. So, what other similarity did you find? Richard?
The other similarity that the men are born and remain equal rights. Citizens have the rights of petition, and also the citizens can own a weapon.
All right, so the right to bear arms?
Yeah, the right to bear arms, but not only just that. It says any of those rights only going to be punished by legal authority.
By?
Legal authority.
Okay, all right. The weapons, all right? Hold on to that idea. I want to come back to that, all right? Hold on to that idea. Other folks, James, other similarities?
found that
And if you can give me the number as well, if that's possible, in the U.S. and the French list of rights.
number 7, where it says no person shall be accused or arrested or imprisoned. That one right there.
In the American one?
No, in the French.
In the French, okay.
And the American one, I think, let's see, the right to a fair trial, speedy trial.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
He was allowed to, have representation, a fair trial.
Okay, good. Thank you. Once again, just like in the English Bill of Rights, not the English Bill, did it say that? Yes, in the English Bill of Rights, just like the U.S. Bill of Rights, and just like in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the people recognize the government has a right to punish you, but it has to be a fair punishment, it has to be a transparent punishment, everyone knows what the punishment is, it has to be a fair trial, it has to be a speedy trial. The government can't just say you're guilty, throw you in jail for 10 years, and then eventually have a court case.
Proof.
It has to have proof. It's got to be totally transparent, right? Yeah. What else? Other similarities?
So the Congress.
Oh, hang on. You've already gone. John, go ahead.
I was going to say something similar to him, and that's they no longer going to be persecuted, which means that they have to see a jury before they.
Oh, okay. All right. Is there another one that you came across besides the right to trial and jury and so on and so forth? Jennifer, how about you? What similarities that came across for you? I'm sorry?
They mentioned the one
They mentioned all the ones that you had? Okay, then let's go to differences. What differences did you find? I'm going to start with you. I've already gone through my other 4, so you're my 5th one. Give me a difference that you found. You want a moment? Okay. Other folks that haven't gone yet, what differences that you find? Zarisha? And then Dinesha.
in the French document, Bill of Rights, sorry, that's false. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man, there's like a little clause that limits freedom of speech.
Where is that? Do you remember what number you're referring to? So we could all go through it together?
Sure, I can find it. It's on the 2nd page.
I think it's number 10, right? No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including disquieted means, told to be quiet. No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. What does that mean, Zarisha?
I mean, I can only talk in when it comes to American tradition of limiting freedom of speech. It's like you can't use your freedom of speech in a way that's going to cause mass chaos or that will falsely accuse somebody of something in
You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, lead to a stampede, and people die, right? That's basically what you're saying.
Limitations.
Yes.
Right.
But it also says something about people who abuse free speech being they can be punished for it.
Any chance? Do you happen to know what number?
It acknowledges that individuals are responsible for the abuse of their freedom of speech.
Yeah, that's right. Every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. Who is defining the limits then? Who is creating the laws now in France if there's no longer absolute monarchy? The people, represented in what body? They used to be called the Third Estate, but now they're called the what? The National Assembly. So according to the French, limits on free speech are fine because the limits are being created by the people, not by a king, not by the nobles, right? What other differences did you come across? Actually, Richard, you mentioned guns. The Second Amendment, or the second right in the U.S. Bill of Rights, says a well-regulated militia and militia means essentially volunteer soldiers, not full-time military. Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Right? So this is it has been interpreted by many Americans as a very wide permission of all people to own guns. Right? Even though here it clearly states a well-regulated militia, which is an organized group of people and not Joe the bear hunter living in the woods. But that's for another conversation. Where does weaponry and all that stuff get mentioned, if at all? Richard, do you happen to know in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man where weaponry and self-defense or anything is mentioned?
It's on the third, right?
Let me see.
No right and no individual exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation.
Okay, well that just says that the only laws that can only be made by the government that represents the people or the nation.
Okay.
But where in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man does it mention defense, guns, anything? Shakira?
Well, to me, number 12 is talk about public military forces and like not
Okay.
having personal.
Who wants to read number 12 of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man? Nikki, go ahead.
The security of the rights of men and of the citizens requires public military forces. These forces are therefore established for the good of all and not for the personal advantage of those to whom they shall be entrusted.
Right. Public military forces, armies, navies, marines, that must protect the people's rights and not become the instrument to oppress the people, right? Another limitation, right? Public military forces, this is an official thing. It's not like a voluntary bunch of soldiers like the militia is. Another limitation on a right. Any other difference that you'd like to highlight? Other differences?
Freedom of assembly.
Who said that? Denisha? You see that there's a difference between the U.S. and the French Bill of Rights regarding freedom of
I
assembly?
haven't seen nothing of freedom of assembly in the French. I've seen it say it in the U.S. and in the first one where it says peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a record of
Okay. So let's take a look at the French one.
I don't know, something like that.
Well, look at number 6. Everyone look at number 6. Law is the expression of the general will. Do you remember which philosopher brought us that term, the general will? You remember? It wasn't Voltaire, it wasn't Locke, it wasn't Smith, it wasn't Beccaria. It begins with an R? Rousseau. He gave us this idea, the general will, what the people want. All right? So, the law is an expression of the general will. Every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation. That sort of hints at freedom of assembly. It hints, right? What else we got here? What else is a good one? Number 11. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of those precious of the right. Every citizen may accordingly... Yes. So this can mean printing the communication of ideas, but it can also mean the expression verbally, which you would do in an assembly, so that people could actually hear you. Freedom of assembly. Anything else? I think that's it. Yep.
U.S. Bill of Rights, you don't have the political participation isn't a guaranteed right, and in the French Declaration of Rights of Man, it is.
In this particular case, I'm being a little unfair. Because the U.S. Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to what? Does anybody know what it is? The Constitution. And the Constitution lays out the right to representation. When it says, Congress shall be organized so that blah, 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 every state has 2 senators, every district has 1 representative. I wasn't going to sign the whole Constitution because you all would have gone crazy. But I can just tell you, right? Now, but that's a good point. Let me see. Let me see. All right. Let me point your attention to, this is my favorite one. Okay, number 13 and number 14. Somebody read number 13 for me. Jennifer, I'm going to you. Read number 13 for me, please. Of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Common back.
Yeah.
Constitution is essential for the maintenance of the public order and for the cause of administration. There should be
Equitably.
distributed among all citizens in proportion to the community.
Okay, what do you think they're referring to when they say a common contribution? A common contribution to the government. What's that another word for? Taxes. Taxes. And so number 13 is saying, as a citizen, you have the rights that we've laid out in this document, but you also have obligations. You got to pay taxes to your government, not the government of the king, your government, because you need to pay for a military, roads, bridges, a navy, blah, 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 blah. Number 14. Who wants to read that one? Give me number 14. Go ahead, John. Not John. Keith.
All citizens have a right to decide, either personally or by their representative, as to the necessity of the public contribution, to grant this freely, to know to what uses it is put, and is to fix the proportion, the mode of assessment and of collection, and the duration of assessment.
So this is saying that not only do you have to pay taxes, but you have the right to determine what taxes, how they're collected, how they're paid for, because you have the right to representation. It's your government making, this is taxation with representation, right? In the U.S. Bill of Rights, is there anything that says you have an obligation to pay taxes? No. In the Constitution, when it talks about Congress and its powers, it says that the government has the right to collect taxes directly on the American people. But that's it. It doesn't dress it up. It just says Congress has the right to pass laws, one of them being taxes, because the Americans get bothered by taxation without representation, and we're giving you representation. So, the reason why, and just to wrap this up, the reason why the French Declaration of the Rights of Man has specific limits on freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, it makes it clear that you have to pay taxes, because that's one of your obligations. The reason it does all these things is because, unlike the United States, you have 25 million Frenchmen living in a rather small chunk of land, people living on top of each other. In America, people are much more spread out. You can say things like everybody has a right to bear arms, and you're not going to feel the problem of that as much as in a place like France that is so densely populated. Moreover, there's a recognition of bankruptcy. Everyone's got to pay their taxes if you're all citizens, because we're bankrupt, and we can't keep taxing the poor. In a nutshell, the French recognized that you just can't talk openly about broad freedoms because you have too many people living in the same spot, And if you unleash this desire, you're going to have trouble. So you can have freedoms, but let's be reasonable. All right? So, any questions?
Yeah,
Yep.
because
Yeah.
do you think that the Declaration of Right of Man gives more privilege to men than women?
Yes. Because there was a French Declaration of the Rights of Women that came out 2 years later, and that woman was executed for being too radical.
In fact, instead of those rights that state that the freedom we're giving as people as whole, right? Yeah.
Well, the U.S. Bill of Rights talks about all, but women didn't have the vote, or blacks, or at the time, poor people. But later on, they did, and of course, the equality in the U.S. Bill of Rights was universally applied later. All right, folks, hand in your stuff on the way out.